Hi everyone. Thank you for coming along. Firstly, thank you for making it all the way upstairs and making it almost the end of day 2 at Big Data London. I'm Stephen, so I lead the data or BI function at Little GB. I've been there for nearly 3 years. I must confess, Lidl launched a new brand this week, and I really went to town on some of their imagery and a lot of their primary colours, so I apologise in advance. Before we get into the meat of the talk, for those that don't know, I should explain what Lidl is. Lidl is part of Schwarz Group, which is a German-founded, privately owned company. It is the largest retailer in Europe and the 4th largest in the world. We have lots of employees that generate lots of euros across a lot of countries. It's made up of those 5 companies in the retailing, recycling, production and digital space. So then specifically for Lidl, we have lots of stores, over 12,600 across 31 countries in Europe and the US. Again, a lot of employees, and it generates a lot of euros for the overall group. And then Lidl GB is a retailer, so we are, the last time I checked, we were 8.3% grocery market share, over 30,000 employees, lots of colleagues, 14 distribution centres across England, Scotland and Wales, and we have just under 1,000 stores. We're working towards that. So what I want to talk about today is just really my journey at Lidl. So it has to start with the challenges that I'd faced. So to set the scene a little bit, we have lots of data, lots of legacy systems, lots of information, lots of people that are hungry for that data, which is good, but it's very much in a report, tabular kind of format. The data is, as you can imagine, from a business that's been around for a long time and not technology first, is everywhere. And for us to make any development or any changes, it takes quite a long time. We have a massive backlog, and ultimately, a lot of the work we were doing was sort of tactical, ad hoc, not massively strategic. So what we started to do is I went around a lot of our key stakeholders at head office, I went into our regions, I spoke to our store staff, spent time and things like that, and got a lot of feedback from them as to what our challenges were, but what their perception of the same challenges are. So I've now got 4 quotes of genuine feedback that we got, which I guess everyone should be able to relate to in some form. So why are the numbers different in these 2 dashboards? We've got too many reports to read. Can you just dump the data, which is an old classic. And my absolute favourite, which is from one of our area managers, I have to check 15 reports every week to find out just everything's green. So this person that's super busy, where their main job isn't to consume information, is spending a lot of time, and then it doesn't even help them afterwards. The other challenge we have at a head office perspective is there's a really common scenario. If there was a challenge with our availability, such as our stock in store or in our supply chain, our operational colleagues would get together, they would talk about it, they would talk about it some more, and then they might come and talk to us and ask us for something if we're lucky. What this then leads to is we were quite reactive, there was potentially a lot of duplication, and ultimately we didn't have the right seat at the right table. So what we started out to do is then start to answer 3 key questions based on all the feedback and sort of experience and things. So is that data accurate and consistent? Are the dashboards, the data reports accessible and people know where they are? And ultimately where we really need to get to, which is a place we're not, is information actually insightful? Does it help someone do their job better? At the bottom it is very small, but this is a snapshot of sort of how we changed our strategy around for a whole department, where we had our foundations, so actually our people, our culture, our tools and technology, our processes, but most importantly in the bottom right hand corner there is our education and perception. So how can we better educate the business, how we can help them, and how can we change that perception to get a bit of a seat at the table. The part in yellow is around our always on, so the core information that people need every single day and have had for almost the last 20 years. How do we keep that running while we transition? But then introduce a new layer at the top around our key initiatives. So how do we drive more units? How do we improve our margin? Or ultimately, how do we improve our costs? So we had a really simple goal. Simple and easy to consume and accessible insights that drive better decision making. And most importantly, you can trust it, which we didn't have. So this then becomes aligned to the business, their outcomes, and actually thinks more about the decision making rather than the data itself. So then, where do we start? Naturally, at our foundations. So I presented almost exactly the same slide to some of our senior colleagues as to what we need to do. We're going to reduce our data consolidation efforts. So right now, we would touch data several times for several different use cases and not really reuse it. And as you can imagine, the size of Lido, we've got data in many systems, internal, external, across the group and in country. We're then going to automate it in some way or another and transform that using some of the vendors that are here today. And then ultimately just give a better input. So if it's a dashboard or a report, any piece of analysis or tooling, whatever that may be. So this is great, right? I was really pleased with this diagram. I thought it was going to go down really well. But the reality is more like this. And if anyone knows who created this meme, if they could please let me know afterwards, because I use this regularly. They didn't care about our data model. All they care about is more dashboards, more information, more. And that was the reality of our warehouse or so-called warehouse. So what we had to do was start to think in the way that they do, in the language that they talk, and start to think about, well, how do we improve customer experience? So ultimately, our stores are crucial. Those are the people that, ultimately our customers go, that generate the majority of our revenue. So what we have is roughly, in probably any retail business, is we have 4 principles. Availability, so do we have products in the store? Are they a good quality? Are the store staff helpful? And ultimately, is the store clean? Is that somewhere you want to shop? And actually, can we try and be as efficient as possible with compliance to process and the way we work and things like that? So what I thought to myself is, how can we adapt this for us? And how can we improve the customer experience of our data? So the terminology of those 4 pillars actually can broadly remain the same. So in our availability, is it a reliable source? Is it a decent format? Is it fresh? So is it good quality, accurate and complete? In the customer service, do the right people get it at the right time, and actually can they get it? And then in cleanliness, can it be trusted? So do they want to ultimately shop there, use their information and help them do their job better? So then we then take it a step further with the efficient working, and actually, rather than us working on all these smaller pieces of analysis or smaller reports, can we move less, actually work on much more strategic projects, ultimately achieve more, and we'll be much more as efficient as a team, but ultimately as an overall business. We then took that a step further to try and educate our colleagues. So if you then look at a retail pipeline versus a data pipeline, which is very simplistic, I appreciate, but the principle is hopefully translates. In a traditional retail business, you have information that comes from source, whether that's from a farm or a factory. It ultimately gets into a warehouse, and then we ship it to store for our customers. A data pipeline is kind of similar. We take sources from everywhere. We ultimately want to store it centrally somewhere, and then ultimately ship that to customers for them to do a piece of analysis, any reporting, dashboard, etc. So we then started to brand that as a data supermarket, and this is sort of in flight, so it's not quite fleshed out yet, but essentially what we have now is we have a self-service platform. We're now starting to think about, if you were a customer shopper in our store, how could you then translate in a world where you want to consume data, and how you can actually shop our data, get the data you need for really specific use cases, and actually take action off the back of it. So we're feeling in quite a good space. We're talking the same language. They understand that we need to work on our foundations, and everything's starting to look quite good. I must confess that dog has no relevance other than it's in our new branding and it looks really good. So I've just put that in for the lols. We then had to start to think about that middle pillar though, in terms of how are we communicating, how do people know what information is, how do they access it? We essentially created something called our data hub, which is blurred out for obvious reasons, but essentially is a one-stop shop for information and announcements, any new piece of analysis or insight we've got, any changes to key reporting or dashboards. We would then talk about any tips or tricks on how to use MicroStrategy, any issues, any delays, guidance on how to use all the stuff that we have. and then it's linked to ultimately a Teams channel or some sort of chat, which then allows them to get even further support, which enable the business even further to understand their challenges, understand kind of the pain points that we have, but also further educate them on some of the experiences that we have as the data team, and led to them giving us further buy-in. So this helps with the day-to-day, so the things that happen operationally, this always on section that I described. But in our key initiatives, we still had a long way to go for that. And how can we get in the right rooms with the right people at the right time and sort of help make decisions? So what we started to do was to make 2 insight panels, and they're broadly split between commercial and operational. They have very different needs and are a very different mindset and literacy and various things like that. But essentially what we did is had 2 groups of people that meet monthly, and essentially we have a concept of a data shop where they essentially buy our time. So if they want an initiative, a piece of work or a change or anything, essentially they come together, and we have so much resource and so much time each month that they then help us prioritise and roadmap for the next 3 months. Then we share that transparently across the business so everyone's aware of what we're working on, who it's for, and the perceived benefit at the time. So we're feeling even better because now there's a shared understanding. We're not just talking the same language. They understand our issues day to day, the things that we're working on and how it helps them, and we're starting to get more, in the right rooms and that kind of idea. So we're feeling pretty good about ourselves. Again, dog not relevant, but still looks cool. But then we were all asked this question by our COO: do we help our colleagues thrive? And it's really struck a chord with me this because, the majority of our colleagues are operational, they're in our stores and our warehouses and do a fantastic job. But actually, if you think back to that final quote I shared of, we send them a lot of information, and although we consolidated that down and we try to target a bit more, there is still a lot of information sent from us, but across the business. So what can we do about that? At this stage, I needed a bit of a pep talk. So thanks, Arnie. I really think we've got this. So here's the store manager. If you think of any store manager in any retail business, they have a lot of challenges they have to deal with, apart from the fact that they have to look at data or information or try and do something with it. And for the purpose of this, I had to change it slightly, but they're overwhelmed with information, whether that's from ourselves, from our operational colleagues at head office, or just anywhere, never mind just trying to run the store or do their job. So from our perspective, they're overloaded with information. They can't really find areas of improvement. It's not specific to store, so we send the same information to everyone, so you have to troll for lots of information. Ultimately isn't very efficient and pretty confusing. So we then had to rethink again about, we can work on those strategic topics for our colleagues at head office, but how do we actually best help our colleagues in operations? So I love this quote. If you've not read this book, I would highly recommend it. But we're very output focused as a business, so increased revenue, increased sales, better availability, this kind of idea. But we never really talk about the several processes that we ask our colleagues to do in store every single day to try and achieve those output metrics. So we kind of flipped on its head and said to ourselves, well, let's fix the inputs and outputs will fix themselves. So rather than going after that target and actually trying to achieve it, let's try and have a sort of period of continuous improvement and see how that then links to us achieving those targets. So very simply, we then created a KPI tree. So sales or turnover is ultimately what we're trying to aim for as an output metric. That is ultimately why we're all there. We then have an area of influence because a store colleague can't really influence sales. We can tell them to increase them, but how do they do that? What can they do apart from those customer experience principles? But what they can do, and what we can do at head office with our marketing and Lidl Plus or whatever that would be, is drive more customers, or we can get customers to put more stuff into baskets. But then that then means we've got to have the right availability, and ultimately then the action of those colleagues is to manage those processes and ultimately make sure we've got the right availability if we do drive more customers or we do want to increase our spend or basket size. So what we then started to do was think about a new structure, a new way of working, talking that same language that we mentioned before, powered by that data supermarket. It's in its infancy. So we still have all of our outputs, but they're much more condensed. around more sales, what's our margin or loss in terms of theft and things like that, or availability, etc. But we introduced a new layer around our operational processes, and then we then categorised our deep dive as well around, is it more information about our customer, our internal colleagues, or is it more around our cost? And this then gives a framework for us to then, well, firstly migrate our existing reporting, but also give a way to try and communicate with some of those colleagues. We then took that a step further, so if we play out an example similar to before, if there's a challenge with availability, and for this argument's sake in this example, it's not further down our supply chain, it's a challenge in store, we then have several processes that we link towards that to see actually what are the tangible things people are doing day to day to try and ensure our availability is as best it can be. And then we've got really targeted dashboards or reports that then give them a deep dive further than that they never had before. But then to get even further, so rather than still giving them that overwhelming amount of information, which is more than what they had before, we would then say, well, not every store needs to look at all the same processes. They do them, but it's not that they're not achieving them. So then in this example, there's only limited processes that are affecting availability in this example, and you only have to look at the first dashboard to actually get the right information. So again, cutting the time and resource for our colleagues. We then started to coin that as the term around exception-based reporting. So rather than giving everyone everything, it's then a case of, instead of asking our colleagues to improve X, we'll actually show them how. So then we start to just give them target information on things that they can control and can change and ultimately deliver our outcomes. An example, I'd say sort of, I had to change this, but essentially I'll just touch on a couple of those points where we then have a single page where essentially their colleagues have to look at, and this gives them the key things that they have to work on for that given day, that given week or given month, that are focused to a specific store or department or warehouse. We measure over 80 process metrics. It's then linked to a kind of single document over one page of, if you're not achieving this process metric, what can you do about it? What does it mean? How can you do something about it? We can actually then start to embed much more clever things and give access to previously unknown data to our colleagues. We can adapt quickly. So if there's a new focus area or trials or something's happening in a specific area, we can almost be proactive in how we go about that. And then ultimately everyone's all getting the same information, and we can see really clearly what and how is impacting our business at any given time. So this thing comes with a bit of a mindset shift. So before, if you remember back at the start, we were giving everyone lots of information, try and work it out yourself, try and understand how to drive more unit sales. But now we can start to ask some really big questions. And in this particular example, the question then becomes, well, not what are those processes, how we measure them, do they actually work? We have a lot of colleagues that spend a lot of hours ultimately trying to give the best customer experience possible, but actually the things that we're telling them to do day to day, do they ultimately help and ultimately achieve the goals that we have as an overall business? This then takes it on to more to value. So rather than at the start where we've got a really good foundation, we can start to move up that value chain. And rather than just monitoring information from sort of the background, we can start to investigate, deep dive that with our pseudo analysts across the business or in the wider department, and ultimately start to really drive insight and really guide the business and start to really optimize what we do in our operations, how we can make it more efficient, and start to predict the future. So there's now kind of a bit of love between the data team and the business, which there definitely wasn't before. Where we're at now, yes, our data supermarket's sort of in its infancy. Our insight panels have got more work to do to, ensure value is actually there and things like that. But a lot of the foundations are there, and the relationship between the business and the data team has changed in the almost 3 years that I've been there. Ultimately, we're achieving a lot of our targets. We have increased literacy across the business, and there's a real shared understanding as to the challenges that we all face. For us internally, we're using much more modern tech, faster for development. The team are actually working on things that drive real genuine insight and actual change in action, and ultimately it reduces our running costs and the ability to fully automate, to improve our availability, our data quality and all those things, and ultimately it's more efficient for everyone. So some takeaways and some lessons. I would say from my few years is feedback is key. If we never got that at the start, I don't think any of that would have been possible. Spending time with the end users in the stores, in the regions, other colleagues at head office is absolutely crucial. Knowing your audience, so speaking the same language and having a shared understanding as to what that means. I say over communicate, we don't do this particularly well, but I think the more you share and the more you communicate what you're doing and what the challenges are you face, people are more likely to collaborate and work together. And then think process. Depending on the type of business you work in, certainly in a retail space, which is product store, there's a lot of processes throughout our business, and this approach that we've taken has now been adapted across our warehouses, into our HR colleagues, into our buying process, almost everywhere. And then deliver. So have a plan, communicate it, stick to it, and if you can't communicate, and ultimately measure the success and benefit, because that will then give me more wins, more seats at tables, and more opportunities in the future. So thank you. Connect with me on LinkedIn if you would like to, and I'll be around for a few minutes afterwards if anyone's got any questions. Thank you very much.